One of the major challenges in implementation of antibiotic stewardship programs is the lack of diagnostic facilities, especially in the secondary care centers. So we do require facilities for doing microbial culture and sensitivity testing. Then only can we find out whether there is a requirement for actual antibiotic monitoring. How we monitor it is through this basic methods of surveillance. The next point where we require investment is in a setup of a proper hospital infection control team with a ICN, that is your infection control nurse, who should be approximately 110 to 1 ratio in a hospital. So unless you have this HICC setup, it is difficult to roll out an antibiotic stewardship program, because both of them, it's like functioning arms of a body. Both are required for a proper function. So implementation of antibiotic stewardship should actually be preceded by the setup of a hospital infection control committee in your secondary care.
So the main challenge in implementing the antibiotic stewardship program, especially in the middle level hospitals, which form a major chunk of the antibiotic prescription, is we don't have the clinical pharmacist, which might not be feasible always, or an infectious disease specialist, which might not be feasible to employ in a secondary level hospital. So in those settings, we need to identify a senior physician who is interested in conducting the program or taking up the challenge of being a team leader for the antibiotic stewardship program, who might be respected by the whole hospital, so that he can act as a team leader. And in addition to that, we need to identify champions from the hospital who can who is respected by the whole hospital, or who will be listened to in the hospital. So the main thing is we have to identify somebody who is interested in conducting or taking up the leadership of an antibiotic stewardship program in a secondary level hospitals.
In a secondary level hospital where hierarchical system is there, it is important to educate the doctors as well as the management about the antibiotic stewardship. The learning about antibiotic stewardship is very important to ensure a short-term implementation of the antibiotic. Another point is that as prescribers, we always tell that we have prescribed the medicine because of the pressure from the patients, but actually it's important to educate the patient about the need of antibiotic and the consequences of unnecessary prescription, so that they'll also know the side effect of it, and this pressure term is avoided.
So thank you so much. And I'm sure from the
Dr. Jason Newland, and Dr. Newland served on the planning committee for this
let me
event
just
today.
stop the other video.
He's the associate professor of pediatrics at Washington University Medical School.
So good morning once again to everyone, and again, thank you so much for making time for this session, like you always do. Very much appreciated to attend these sessions for the AMR Leaders Program for tertiary students in Africa. And from our last session, thank you so much, Alex. Alex from Uganda actually reminded us and volunteered to pray. So this morning, I'll ask for a volunteer to pray for us before we start our session. Anyone who can volunteer to pray for us this morning? Anyone?
Let's pray.
Thank you, Alex.
We thank you, God our Father, for keeping us throughout the night and bringing us today for the most important session for our leadership stewardship. We ask that you guide us, you guide our facilitators, you guide the learners, so that what we are going to receive today, we put into practice, so that we are able to fight AMR in our locality. I ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, Alex. So today we'll focus on antimicrobial stewardship in human health, and this will be followed by a session on AMR and sustainable food systems. So before we start that, I'll just do a very quick recap of the last session that we had. We did have a short break, and I'm sure we managed to actually rest a bit. And so today we'll focus on, as I said, AMS. Last time when we met, which was on the 21st of August, we did have a session from Dr. Emmanuel. I'm sure we all remember this very interesting session where he focused on the effects of urbanization and socio-ecological dynamics on public health. He was talking of the pressures of just the basic infrastructure, which is very relevant in our context here in Africa, the natural environment, the pressures that are there, the issues of wash, and also the urban and peri-urban livestock keeping, where there is a lot of cohabitation with the animals due to pressures of housing that we face in the community and all the effects that it has on AMR. So he also motivated us a lot and challenged us in addressing this AMR complex problem, what we need to do, reminded us that we are carrying the future of Africa, and Africa actually depends on our solutions. He said mindset change is very key, behavioral change key for the ultimate success in this complex multi-sectoral problem. And it was important to take responsibility within our spheres or areas of influence. And we ended with breakout group discussions where we had a lot of interesting feedback. I'm sure you remember. And thank you so much for all the students who volunteered to be the chairs for those groups, and also the ones who rapporteured. And we looked at the challenges, the benefits of using a One Health approach in addressing AMR, the risks of cohabitation with animals, and antibiotic use in plants. Another group looked at the issues of intensive farming systems, and also the implications of poor waste management practices on AMR. And from those group sessions, I'm sure if you reflect back, you actually had questions that you had, some things that you also reflected on later, even after the session. So today, even as the presentations are going on, today we will have two presentations, as I mentioned. We'll start off with Dr. Yara, and we'll also have Dr. Victor talking about the animal health side. So as the presentations are going on, as usual, please remember to put your questions in the chat so that we'll be able to take them. We'll take the questions at the end of after the two presenters have spoken. That's when we'll then take in the questions. So before I call our first speaker of today, I'll start by inviting our director, Dr. Mefin Mpundu, to offer a few opening remarks on a topic that I know he's personally very passionate about. Dr. Mefin has done extensive work around AMS in our context in the African region and also beyond, including assisting countries in coming up with AMS policy documents and supporting various stakeholders, right from the health facility level up to the level where he actually supports organizations like the World Health Organization, WHO, in coming up with AMS guidelines that can help countries, health facilities in implementation of antimicrobial stewardship. So over to you, Dr. Mefin, for a few opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julia, again, and thanks to everyone who has again faithfully joined the the training. It's always a joy to have all these zealous, energetic champions from many universities, but also to have some experts that spend some time with us. Special thanks to Dr. Yara, a friend of mine, and Dr. Yamo, both friends of mine. Dr. Yara is in Egypt, so it's great to have her join us and share some experiences on the successful program that she's been leading on antimicrobial stewardship. I will not preempt the presentations, and I think we again have done something that is quite important, that we are looking at it from two angles, trying to look at it from the human side, but also approaching also from the animal, the planetary, and the agricultural sector at the same time. Stewardship is very fundamental to us being able to contain antimicrobial resistance, and the more that I spend time around working on stewardship, the more that I realize that that some fundamental building blocks really missing in most of our health institutions and most of our countries. Fundamental blocks such as guidelines are not available, such as labs that are quite dysfunctional, but even facilities that have labs, they've got clinical pharmacists, they've got infectious disease doctors, they've got guidelines, they have no issues with access to antibiotics. Even in those facilities, stewardship tends to be a major problem. So one of the things that we need to consider, even as we think about, we learn about the principles around stewardship, is that it's also a behavioral change. It takes change to actually be a good steward of what has been entrusted to us, and in this case, it's the public good of antimicrobials. And so there is the angle of behavioral change that is important for us to consider, and I'm sure our colleagues are going to amplify a bit on that as they share with us this morning. So I'd like to say thank you so much again. It always encourages me to see all you guys involved in discussions, and this topic of stewardship remains even more and more relevant actually today, as we see a lot of misuse and overuse of antibiotics in the in this COVID era, that are not based on science, both in the human sector and also in the animal and the veterinary sector. So with those words, I just hope that we shall enjoy our sessions today, and again keep the discussions live. Post the questions, and so that our presenters will be able to get back to us. So just wishing everybody a great morning and a fruitful session. Thank you so much, and back to Julian.
Thank you so much, Dr. Murphy. And I'll introduce our first speaker for today, who's Dr. Yara Mawson, and she'll make a presentation on antimicrobial stewardship in human health. Dr. Yara is an infectious disease clinical pharmacist in charge of the AMS program at International Medical Center Hospital in Cairo, Egypt. She's also a WHO consultant on AMR surveillance. And Dr. Yara has actually worked with us quite a lot. She has supported us in our past React Africa forums, the annual React Africa conference that we always have. She's always very instrumental in actually offering practical insights to fellow colleagues working on AMR in the region. And Dr. Yara is a clinical pharmacist with extensive experience across the globe. She has worked in England. She's also currently working as, she supports students actually in different universities in Egypt for undergraduate and postgraduate students in pharmacy. and also a member of the board certified pharmacotherapy specialist, and she's also doing her master's in public health and epidemiology at the High Institute of Public Health, Alexandria University. And she's also part of the CEDRIC consortium and also an ambassador for clinical research in AMR insights. So that's a handful, and indeed very appropriate to have such a person offer insights to students. It's interesting to hear, which is something I didn't know, that she actually has been working with students as well. But I know she has done a lot of work in her health facility and is indeed an AMS champion. So over to you, Dr. Yara.
Good morning. Thank you so much for the introduction. Thank you, Dr. Murphin, Dr. Daniel, and Dr. Julian. It's always really a pleasure to connect. I was always a pleasure to have contributed in React, and always looking forward to it. I'll just start sharing my presentation, so just a minute. So I just want to make sure, can you see my screen, please?
Yes, we can see it, Dr. Yara. Please go ahead.
That's perfect. Thank you so much. So actually, taking from what Dr. Murphin was just saying, first, the objective of today's session is actually we want to take an overlook or an overview in regards to antimicrobial stewardship. But first, we need to give some heads up regarding AMR or antimicrobial resistance. So I'm pretty sure everyone's familiar with the O'Neill's diagram, this very famous diagram that actually implies that within the upcoming 30 years or so, there will be huge death tolls attributed to antimicrobial resistance. That's going to reach about 10 million deaths per year because of AMR or because of antimicrobial resistance. This is the suggested distribution of the death tolls, and as you can see here in this slide, Africa actually takes a huge part in regards to the AMR predicted death tolls. But actually, what the question I want to ask is this question: do you think that this very famous O'Neill's diagram is for real? Do you think that the true estimate of people who are going to die
It looks like we have lost Dr. Yara.
Hey, Julian, maybe as you wait, you can replay the video so that.
Yeah, it looks
yes,
like.
I'm so sorry.
Oh, it's okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm really sorry. I'll start sharing the screen again. So actually, I was just saying in regards to the expected death tolls because of AMR, I was speaking about the famous O'Neill's diagram and if the number is actually true or not. This study was published in 2016, actually tackling or addressing this question, that it's very important to be working on surveillance data from the low, middle, and high income countries in order to address this question and actually come up with an answer if this burden is actually a true one, or it maybe even it's underestimated and maybe the numbers are actually more. So this is the famous IDSA, and the IDSA is the Infectious Disease Society of America, which is actually published guidelines for the empirical usage of antimicrobials. It has issued this like a book or article about phases of antimicrobial resistance.
Dr. Yara?
Yes.
If you can kindly switch to the presenter mode.
Okay,
when
yes,
lost
sure.
connection, yeah.
Yeah, okay, sure. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
So actually, this is, again, I was talking about the IDSA. This actually shed the light about the importance and the impact of antimicrobial resistance and how actually it's going to affect the lives of many people and how actually people have lost their lives because of antimicrobial resistant bacterial and fungal infections. So the first person who actually did predict this was Sir Alexander Fleming. What he actually is the person who invented the penicillins. He said that there will come times where the penicillins will just be bought from any place and anywhere, and this will actually be the nuclei of starting resistance to penicillin. He was actually not aware that he was not just talking about penicillins, but even other antimicrobials in the future. So I just want to shed the light on the terminology of antimicrobial resistance. So it's not antibiotic resistance only, because talking about practically the current situation, I mean, in my hospital setting even, we do face actually problems per se with antifungals. So we do have these candida infections that are azole resistant, and sometimes even we have this candida auris, which is even echinocandine resistant, which is echinocandines are broad spectrum antifungals. So the issue is not only with antibiotics. Yes, of course, antibiotics are the most, we face like huge problems with them, but actually we're starting to face similar problems with antifungals and antivirals as well for some modified sequences of viral infection. So again, in the past slides, I was just talking about AMR, antimicrobial resistance. Now, this where the question comes. What's the relation between the antimicrobial consumption and antibiotic resistance or antimicrobial resistance? Why there is something called antimicrobial stewardship? Is there a real relationship between the consumption and the resistance? Well, this article answers this question. This is a meta analysis article that was published in 2014 and actually establishes a very strong and clear relationship between the antimicrobial consumption and the antibiotic resistance. So we can come up from this slide that if we want to control, to curb the antimicrobial resistance, we can start working on developing policies or stewardship or whatever the terminology you want to say, but we need to start working on the antimicrobial consumption. So actually, based on the video that was just displayed at the beginning of today's session, actually, based on the interviews, there are many drivers for the use of antibiotics and antimicrobial consumption by the prescribers, by the dispensers, and even the community. So actually, some of them were actually tackled in the video, but I really want to shed the light on different perspectives. So we do have, of course, the lack of appropriate knowledge in regards to the prescribers. as the one of the doctors was saying in the video, there are no maybe specialized infectious disease pharmacists or infectious disease consultants or infectious disease physicians in most of the healthcare facilities. So this actually represents a huge problem when dealing with or when trying to face the problem of antimicrobial consumption. Other actually factors are the patient demand. So I guess this is one of the very important things that we can start working on. And of course, I know there are many activities that are currently tackling this issue, which is the demand of the patient. The patient sees that antimicrobial is one of the standard care elements. They have to receive antibiotic regardless their case. So there is not enough awareness or knowledge regarding the antimicrobials and how to use them and the impact of not using them in the correct form. Of course, we do have the incorrect norms, and honestly, I do face this in real practice. So we have these consultants sometimes that are very focused on prescribing per se empirical antifungals for many patients, specifically in the intensive care unit. So patient is not improving on antibiotics just even for 24 hours. They just prescribes antifungal for patients specifically in the ICUs without using the proper diagnostics that we sometimes have or we have in our hospital to actually be more sure or more consistent regarding the AMR the antibiotics prescribing. So this is a data that was actually published. It states that I call it the 30% rule. So I guess this is a huge eye opener and a very alarming data that states that we can say that 30% of the antibiotics that are prescribed in the community, 30% of the hospital pharmacy costs are due to antimicrobial use, and 30% of the costs could be saved by implementing an appropriate antimicrobial stewardship program. If you can look at the other graph, the bar chart here, which tackles the problem of unnecessary antimicrobial therapy, we can say that I mean, these are the most common problems that we do face even in real life practice, which is the duration of the therapy. So you can start by giving actually, okay, the right antibiotic, the right choice, the perfect choice for the patient. But then the antibiotics keeps on and on and on. They have this fear of de-escalating the antimicrobial regimen. And we will talk this thoroughly when we discuss the implementation of stewardship. Sometimes antimicrobial are prescribed for non-infectious syndromes. So I have this fever of unknown origin, or maybe central fever or drug-induced fever, and then they do give antimicrobials or do prescribe antimicrobials for this reason. One of the other main issues that we do face in real life is the treatment of the contamination. So I have this blood culture, it's per se a coagulase negative staph, it's a contaminant, but the physician insists on treating this bacterial infection. He does not know when and how to differentiate between a real infection and a colonization. We actually face this problem again, specifically for patients in the ICUs who do have prolonged stays in the intensive care unit. So to sum things up before starting specifically talking about the antimicrobial stewardship, actually taking from what Dr. Murphin was currently saying, that AMR governance, it's like a circuit, it's a framework, okay? So we do have the policy design, we do have the importance of the strategic vision, the accountability, the governance. Everyone knows their role, everyone knows their part in this multidisciplinary approach in tackling AMR. And then we do have the implementation tools. And as you can see here, we talked about the importance of the surveillance in the beginning of the session and how it's very important to help us identify the burden of the true burden of AMR and the mortality because of antimicrobial resistant bacterial or even fungal infection. Antimicrobial stewardship is also part of this implementation process in order to tackle the problem of the AMR. We have the infection prevention, control, education, public awareness. So all of these are implementation tools that we can use to help us face the AMR problem, which is actually, this is a global threat. So I've been saying antimicrobial stewardship a lot in my presentation. So what is antimicrobial stewardship? Simply AMS or antimicrobial stewardship, it's a coordinated program. So it's a multidisciplinary program. This program, it actually promotes the appropriate use of antimicrobials, including, of course, again, antibiotics, antifungals, antiviral. The main goal of the stewardship program is to improve the patient outcome, again, to reduce the antimicrobial resistance and decrease the spread of infections by the NDROs. So if I want to give a practical definition for AMS or antimicrobial stewardship, I would say this slide actually sums up the definition of AMS or antimicrobial stewardship. So actually, these are the questions that I believe that we should ask ourselves every time we prescribe, we audit, we revise an antimicrobial agent for a patient. So first, we need to make sure that we're giving the right antibiotic. I need to make sure that this is the right choice. I'm targeting the right organism that is suspected in this case. I need to ask myself if the patient do have any risk factors for resistance. Per se, in my hospital, we deal a lot with oncology patients and dialysis patients where they have been recently admitted to the hospitals with prior resistant organisms and prior cultures that do have resistant organisms. I need to ask myself, maybe I'm prescribing the right antibiotic, but is this antibiotic actually penetrating the site of infection? So I'm treating meningitis per se. Am I giving the right antibiotic that would actually bypass the blood-brain barrier and target and actually treat this infection? The next category of question, which is, am I giving it to the right patient? Or this patient, is he having a true infection, or is it a colonization? Is it an asymptomatic bacteria in the urine, or is the patient really having a urinary tract infection? So I can guide my my choice based on answering these questions. One of the very important things is actually to target the most appropriate timing for initiation of antimicrobial. So I don't want to start to get a culture after beginning the patient or after the patient starts on antimicrobial. Then the culture, I will not be sure of the culture results, and I will not be sure on how to target the antimicrobial based on the culture susceptibility and culture results. If the patient is a sepsis or a septic shock, am I giving it in the right time that the patient is supposed to have? Am I giving it in the right dose for the patient? So per se, this is a pediatric patient, so I need to calculate the body surface area for this patient. This patient is a geriatric patient, so I just want to make sure that this antimicrobial would be given by the same dose for this patient. This is an obese patient. This is a patient with an acute kidney injury. I have to ask myself all these questions to make sure that I'm giving the right dose for the patient. Again, for the route, we have multiple routes for giving antimicrobials. So we have the IM, the IV, the oral, we have the intraventricular, we have the intrathecal, intraperitoneal, so we have inhalation. We have different routes for giving the antimicrobials. So what is the most appropriate route for this patient? And of course, the last thing is to, again, I want to do the least harm to the patient. So I don't want to give these broad spectrum antibiotics. I don't want to give a very long duration. As I was just saying, I mean, this is one of the really very hard problems that I do face in practical work when working with the patients and the physicians, which is the duration. Am I giving the minimum duration for the patient? am I choosing the antibiotic with the least side effects? So per se, these antibiotics could cause thrombocytopenia. This antifungal could cause thrombocytopenia, and my patient is already suffering from very low platelet count. So this is very important. All these questions, I believe, are very important if you want to apply the principle of the antimicrobial stewardship. So again, the benefits of the AMS or the stewardship program, based on what we've been actually recently saying, it will improve the clinical outcomes. So I'm giving the patient the most appropriate antibiotic, the right choice. So of course, I'm giving the right choice at the right time. The patient will improve, and this will affect the management of the case that I'm having. We will reduce the antimicrobial consumption. So if the patient is colonized, I'm not going to prescribe an antimicrobial. So I'm reducing the consumption of the antimicrobial, which we just linked with the impact of the AMR. I'm reducing the cost for the patient and for the hospital. So I don't need to give all these antibiotics. I don't need to give all these combinations. I just know what I'm targeting, and I'm giving it based upon the culture results, and at the beginning based on the empirical guidelines, as was Dr. Murphy was saying, the treatment guidelines or the national treatment guidelines that I do have. Again, of course, I will reduce the treatment failure. Again, I'm giving the antibiotic at its right timing. I'm ensuring that the antibiotic I'm giving is having the perfect penetration for the site of infection. So I'm having this skin soft tissue infection, I'm having meningitis, and so on. So I'm targeting the site of infection I need to work. So we talked about the definition of the AMS. We talked about a brief on a practical definition of an AMS and what's the importance of AMS. So let's talk about how can I implement an antimicrobial stewardship. So these are the CDC core elements. They were first released in 2014, and then this is the updated version of 2019. These are the core elements if I want to have a hospital-based antimicrobial stewardship program. So the first thing, again, this was displayed in the video, which is the hospital leadership commitment. It's very important to have support from the hospital leadership, to have a written statement of commitment from the hospital leadership. This happens actually if I'm aware of the things I want to tackle in my hospital, if I do a good case presentation, if I build a proper case, and then maybe talk with the management in the hospital maybe I'm working in, so then I can have their full support, including the logistics, the financial and technology resources. The second thing, it's the accountability. So what is accountability? So I have this team, I plan to have these champions, this team, okay? And I need to know what is the role of every person included in the team. What is he accounted for? So what is his tasks, terms of reference, and so on. In the update of the CDC, it actually shed the light on the importance of having a drug expertise, a pharmacist, okay? So a pharmacist can be the leader or maybe the co-leader of the stewardship program. He will help so much leading the implementation to improve the antimicrobial use. Regarding the action, I will speak in details just a minute, so I will not go through it right now, but we will talk about what actions can we do to implement stewardship in the facility or the center we're working in. Again, one of the most important things, is tracking. Again, we have to monitor, we have to do surveillance, we have to do auditing, because this will help us reflect the true situation of the place I'm working in. And again, this will help us again assess the burden of the antimicrobial consumption and the antimicrobial resistance. We have to have a reporting system. This can be very simple. You can report maybe in the Pharmacy and Therapeutics Committee, the Infection Control Committee, whatever suits the place you're working in, because it's not one size fits all. It's again, every person knows the strength, weakness, and opportunities and threats of the place is working in. So you can make your own plan based upon the your own resources in the place that you work. At last, the education is a very important core element in implementation of the antimicrobial stewardship. Again, education not only to the healthcare practitioners, but again to the public. This is really very important because this is turning out to be a public issue. This is not only a hospital issue. Again, this is the same, but this is the WHO healthcare tools of the low middle income countries, again, tackling the same points by the CDC. So I was just speaking about the actions that can be done through the implementation of the stewardship. I just want to emphasize on one important point. Stewardship doesn't have to be a complicated process. So you can do even one of these actions. You can do a very small intervention, but sustainable intervention. This will have a huge impact rather than doing many things that are not sustainable actions. So I'm just giving different examples of the action that can be done. So we do have the prospective audit and feedback, where you do actually do rounds with the consultants and the physicians and discuss the patients and discuss the appropriate antimicrobial choice that you want to start on. We have the pre or prior authorization, where you have this list of restricted antimicrobials that are only dispensed based on the approval maybe of the senior clinical pharmacist, the ID pharmacist, the consultants, whatever you decide in your own facility. You have to give a rationale for why you are actually putting this antimicrobial in the restriction list, maybe because this is it's a broad spectrum antimicrobial. One of the examples that I actually did in my hospital was putting the cefoperazone sulbactam in a restriction list because simply it was overly used by the surgeons as a surgical prophylaxis. So I had to add it in the restriction list. So it has to be approved before it's dispensed for the patient. We have the facility-specific treatment guidelines, or having a national or a local guidelines based on the local biogram. And they are infection-based interventions, pharmacy-based interventions, microbiology, and of course, nursing interventions. So if the nurse is simply giving the antimicrobial by the correct route of administration and the correct final concentration, so per se, there is an antiviral, which is the Zovirax. It causes thrombophlebitis if it's given in a high concentration. So if the nurse is well educated and well acquainted with this information, you are actually participating by this very simple action. You are participating, you are contributing in the stewardship principles, because we were just saying if you're doing less harm to the patient, you're actually applying the stewardship concepts. So in the prospective audit and feedback, again, these are all the interventions that you can do. You can again pick one or more, again, according to the situation in the place or the healthcare setting you are working in. So you can ensure that you're choosing the correct choice of the antimicrobial, the correct coverage, again, the correct duration. I know I focus a lot on the duration because we really have this problem of de-escalation. We start the antibiotic and again, we leave it till forever. You can get back to the guidelines. It will help you a lot to identify the correct duration that you keep this patient on. And there are even guidelines for the de-escalation if you want to shift to a narrow spectrum antimicrobial. So what is handshake stewardship? Well, a handshake stewardship, this is the prospective audit and feedback. It's another name for the prospective audit and feedback. And again, this is a study published in the IDSA talking about the importance of handshake stewardship, the importance of having a clinical pharmacist or a pharmacist that rounds with the physician or the consultant to take the most appropriate action according to the patient's condition. It's very important to have this targeting unit. So I'm working in a tertiary hospital. I have 500 patients in my hospital. Who am I going to work with? So am I going to work with the oncology patients? I have a problem in my oncology patients. Am I going to work with the intensive care unit patients? All these questions I can answer if I can do a preliminary audit to know the situation in my hospital, the area where there is a high antimicrobial consumption, the area where there is a huge prescription for antimicrobials per se. So I can target this area and I can start working on this area. And then maybe later on I can extend my interventions to the whole hospital if it's suitable. Again, regarding the pre or prior authorization, you can actually restrict your antimicrobial based on targeted antimicrobials, as the example I was saying. So you want to restrict the novel molecules of antimicrobials. So we just received in the hospital this novel molecule called the ceftazidime avibactam. So I'm putting it in the restriction list because this is a new molecule. Or I can restrict by the time frame. So we don't give this medication after per se 10 p.m. because then there's no clinical pharmacist to revise the prescription. So there are no prescriptions per se for these selected antibiotics after 10 p.m. And then we can select antibiotics for certain conditions, per se, the surgical prophylactic antimicrobials. So for this situation, we do restrict antibiotics only, say, for single doses, and we do not continue after this, except per se in certain case scenarios. This is the WHO aware classification, the access, watch, and reserve group. This is the list created by the WHO to classify the antimicrobials based upon how we can use them. This is another way of classification, and of course the reserve group. These are the novel molecules. These are the last resorts that we don't want to use them use them a lot. You can, again, in the healthcare facility or hospital you're working is, you can track your antimicrobial consumption by per se doing a graph to know every month how much of excess antimicrobials are you using, how much of reserve antimicrobials are you using, and then you can target to per se lessen the choice of using reserved antimicrobials and so on, and put it as a target or a focal point of improvement. Again, these are examples of a national or facility treatment guidelines, again, as Dr. Murphin was just speaking, of having an empirical and surgical prophylaxis guidelines. This slide, I actually think it sums up a lot of what I was just saying. Are the 4 moments of antimicrobial decision making. So these are the 4 questions you need to ask yourself every time you do prescribe antibiotic for the patient, or you do audit antimicrobial for a certain patient. So the first question, is this patient do have this a real infection that will respond to antibiotics? Is he just feverish because he has a subarachnoid hemorrhage per se, and this is a central fever, so this is not an infection type of fever? Have I done the proper culturing and the diagnostic tests? Can I de-escalate? Can I stop? Can I narrow the spectrum? And the duration, how long am I planning to keep my patient on this antimicrobial? I believe it's very important to revise these questions every 48 to 72 hours if the patient is still on antimicrobials. And we call this the antimicrobial timeout. Again, regarding the microbiology, it's very, very, very important, based upon the first interview that you have watched, to know that there is this very, very good synergy, an important synergy between the antimicrobial stewardship program and the microbiology team. So, I mean, you cannot work without a microbiologist. You cannot do interventions without having a proper microbiology, or a connection or a consultation with the microbiologist, regardless the diagnostic. I don't mean you need to have this very novel diagnostics or very rapid diagnostics. Of course, they enhance the process, having a rapid diagnostics and so on. Of course, this enhances the ASP program, but again, you need to work with what you have. But the very important thing is you need to have this very good connection with the microbiology team. They will help you with the antimicrobial susceptibility testing. They will have this comments on the culture. So per se, we have a coagulase negative stuff in a blood culture, and you will find this comment that this might be a colonization for your clinical reference or for your clinical feedback. They will contribute in the formulation of the antibiogram. Of course, they can help with the diagnostic tools per se, the rapid diagnostic tests that can help you have the correct antimicrobial within very short period of time, again, to enhance the patient's outcome. One of the very simple interventions that you can do in the place you're working in is actually having this antimicrobial order form. It's a very simple way to ensure that each prescriber is committed to write the indication of the antimicrobial. Why is the patient is on antimicrobial? Is he giving it for an empiric purpose? Is he giving it for a targeted purpose, and so on? So I believe that this is a very simple intervention that you can do, is to have a separate antimicrobial order form that will let you know and will guide you to know the regimen the patient is on, so it doesn't get lost between other medications the patient's on, and it will help you, and it will commit the physician again to write the indication, so you can follow up the indication and of course the duration that is needed for this specific case. This slide just again talks about the impact of the EMS intervention. So I would just give one example per se. The restriction, this study tackled that the restriction or restricting antibiotic actually did help with reducing the costs by 29%. And I believe this is very huge impact of just doing one intervention, which is the restriction. So again, I was just saying, it's not, you don't have to do all the interventions. You don't have to do everything. You just can make one simple intervention, one simple sustainable intervention that would actually impact the practice in the place you're working in. So to sum things up for this presentation, these are some tips for successful ASP. You need to have a clear objective. You need to have this gap analysis before starting the EMS program in your hospital or the place you're working in. You need to know the areas of defect and start working on it. You need to have this clear line of accountability. So who's doing what and how am I going to represent my data? You need to have this multidisciplinary team. No stewardship works by its own, by the pharmacist by its own, or by the physician by its own. It's a collaborative, it's a multidisciplinary approach. You need to review the guidelines or the tools that you are using on a regular basis based on the changes that's actually happening in your hospital per se. And now you're working with COVID patients per se, having this isolated ICU. So this is a new data, a new criteria for patients, a new that will need different tools or maybe more targeting tools. It's very important to have your outcome measures. So you need to measure how the impact you're doing by per se some tools that can help you out, like the days of therapy, the DOT, or the defined daily dose, the DDD. These are some tools that can help you measure the outcome of your process. The surveillance, the AMR surveillance, it's a sort of an outcome measure. Last thing I want to say, this is a WHO competency-based approach. This is a, let's say this is a course, it's a free course. It has different modules targeting the antimicrobial principles, the principle of writing an antimicrobial, allergy, how to deal with allergies and antimicrobials, infectious disease-based interventions like how to manage urinary tract infection, and how to deal with the microbiology and diagnostics. So I believe that this is really a very nice course that you can take, and it's for free, so it's open access for anyone. And this is actually a study that was assessing a CAP survey that was actually assessing physicians who did take this WHO open access course for antimicrobial stewardship. And one of the conclusions that this actually helped in the attitudes and practices of the physicians towards better prescribing of antimicrobials. Thank you so much. And if you have any questions, please.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yara. I'm sure we will all agree that within these few minutes, you have managed to give us such an extensive presentation, an excellent one. And I'm so glad we are recording this session. We'll share the slides as well, because I'm sure even the students, as they transition into their professional careers, they'll find this very, very helpful. You talked about a lot of things, including the economic consequences, the core elements of antimicrobial stewardship the program, and also the practical, what you have been experiencing at your facility. You shared a lot of resources from WHO, CDC, and also looked at the practical definition, which is very, very important, of AMS, trying to make it as practical as possible in simple terms of the right patient, right time, right dose, right route. So thank you so much for that excellent presentation. And a reminder that I did see some questions coming through, but if we do have more questions, please keep them coming. We'll take these after we have the presentation from Dr. Yamo. You can just please kindly stop sharing your screen, Dr. Yara.
Sure.
Okay, I'll just share a very short video as we get ready for the presentation that is coming from Dr. Yamo, who's with us today, so that we now look at the animal side of things. And now, as that is going on, as I said, make sure that if you have questions, either for Dr. Yara's presentation or the one that this one, I always say OIE, I think had students in mind when they did this one. Anyway, yeah, I think it's very relevant to the youth. Very short. All right, so now I'll introduce our next speaker for today, Dr. Victor Yamo, who will be talking to us about AMR and sustainable food systems. Dr. Yamo is the Farming Campaigns Manager at World Animal Protection Africa Office, where he's actively working with diverse stakeholders, ensuring the critical connection between the welfare of intensively farmed animals, their productivity, quality, safety of the foods produced by these animals, and ultimately what we have on our plates, what the consumers actually consume. Dr. Victor is a veterinary surgeon who also has an MBA from the University of Free State, South Africa, and a certificate on poultry health and management obtained from Denver, Netherlands. He has extensive experience in veterinary services, poultry production systems, and agribusiness. And he has held various management positions, including at Kenchik here in Kenya, Equity Bank, Africa Development Corporation, World Vision International, and he's also a part-time lecturer for animal welfare, ethics and law at a university that's here in Nairobi, Kenya, Jomo Kenyatta University of Agriculture and Technology. And Dr. Victor is also the current counselor for Kenya to the Commonwealth Veterinary Association, CVA, and is also the secretary of a network called Kenya Animal Health Network, and is a full member of the Kenya Institute of Management and also World Poultry Veterinary Association. Dr. Victor is extremely passionate about animal health issues. I'm sure some of the students, especially from Kenya, have seen him on TV quite a number of times trying to advocate on food safety issues and AMR. He has also supported React Africa in various platforms, including especially engaging fellow civil society with a One Health lens in actually addressing this AMR global health threat. So over to you, Dr. Yamo, to share your insights. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Julian. Good mornings, good evening, good afternoons, wherever you are on Africa or in the world. I will try to highlight one or two things around animal welfare, AMR, and how it looks out in the animal sector. So maybe let me just share my screen. I hope you can see the presentation.
Yes, we can, Dr. Yamo. We can just put it in presenter mode. Thank you.
All right, so I will just take you through what we are seeing from the animal side of the business around antimicrobial resistance. I usually say this is the most important slide you'll see in this presentation because it gives you the name of the person presenting, a phone contact where you can find him, and an email address where you can send an email in case you miss something or if you want to clarify anything after today's presentation, even as you look at the slides after today. Briefly, I'll start by highlighting who wild animal protection is, and then I'll move on to the other aspects of the presentation. Wild animal protection is a global NGO that works around animal welfare. We are located in 14 countries or regions as indicated on that slide. And I think the important one is number 8, the Nairobi office that looks after the African business. Our vision is a world where animals live from cruelty and suffering. So it's about looking at animals and how they live across the continent, the globe. And our mission is we move the world to protect animals. And I think the important thing to highlight there is that we is not wild animal protection staffers, but we is all of us put together. That's why we make this presentation. We includes you and I, the students. What is your role in ensuring that animals are protected, and how then does that work for us? Is protecting animals adding any value to our lives as humans? Is it something that we need to look at, or do we just ignore animals as previously done? In terms of our strategic vision, we have just embarked on a 10 years vision, which we are going to be implementing over the 10 years. It has two broad goals. Goal one is about ensuring farmed animals live good lives by transforming the global food system. And I think that's why I am making this presentation today, because we want to understand the global food system. In terms of the global food systems or farming outcomes, we are looking at three main things: no future for factory farming, which I will explain; catalyzing a food revolution, which I will also explain in the next slide; and looking at finance. What is financing the farming systems, and how does that work for Africa? This is the summary of our 10-year food system campaign, but you can look at it in details later. In terms of the three key focus areas, no future for factory farming, it's just ensuring that we need to shift the narrative from factory farming, which the world is slowly beginning to see is not necessary, to then looking at a totally different kind of farming that is then sustainable. And I'll be explaining what factory farming is all about. In terms of food revolution, is looking at how we support and mainstream high welfare production systems, which then cater for the animal. And as we are going to see in the presentation, gives us a better product, but also ensures that ultimately we're ending up with better livelihoods and less diseases and less challenges, especially in matters relating to antimicrobial resistance. And then the third bit is looking at fairer finance, which is then looking at who's funding what. And it's very interestingly, over the last 2 years, we've been tracking who's funding livestock production in Africa and what kind of funding are they, what kind of projects are they funding, and ultimately looking at the welfare systems And again, very interesting things are coming out of it. I think in subsequent presentations over the coming days, we'll be giving you feedback of what we've seen. We've looked at international donors, development partners, private equity banks, and all of them seem to be funding very interesting aspects of production systems, some which are not sustainable and some which are sustainable. Let me move to global food systems, because then we need to understand farming in the context of the food systems around which we operate. And I'll start by saying the global food system a food system encompasses the entire range of actors and their interlinked value-added activities. It looks at production, it looks at aggregation, processing, distribution, consumption, and finally disposal of food and food byproducts. It then interconnects. I know a lot of us have looked at value chains. You talk about the poultry value chain, where you then have the poultry meat value chain and you have the egg value chain. But a food system tries to look at everything. It looks at how what is being produced in agriculture, in crops and crop byproducts is then interlinked into the animal production system, which then has aspects that we need to look at. We look at policy, we look at laws, we look at regulations, we look at other events that are happening. How then do they impact on the food system? And I think the most important thing is that food system needs to be sustainable. Yeah, for it to be able to deliver on food security, to deliver on nutrition, we then need to look at economics. We need to look at what society is looking at, the environment. And I think the best thing is then to use a graphical presentation that then highlights some of these things. You can see that in a food system, what we tend to look at is what's at the top here, the inputs, what goes into farming, things like water, seed, energy, sunlight, chemicals, the know-how, and the labor. But you forget that that food system or that production system that we are putting all those inputs works around an economic system where you look at food wholesalers. And that's why as an organization, we look at retailers. We look at food companies and what are they doing around certain things. We look at restaurants, for instance. Then the transportation around that and what the waste that comes through, how it then regulated and managed. I know a lot of us scientists don't like politics, but the political system then drives the regulations, the subsidies, the ownerships, the laws that then drive that food system. And that then is interlinked with a social system. We look at what is happening in our current studies. We're looking at things like what is happening in the social network. When I talk to students, a lot of you are on the social network, on WhatsApp groups or Instagram, all these things. Those then drive certain things and certain beliefs. They drive how we behave around food systems. The advertising, education, the food culture then drives how we then handle the food system. And then on the other side, we also need to look at how the farming or the food system interacts with the environment. We look at things like biodiversity. We look at things like land use, especially around Africa, where we are having urbanization and we are converting agricultural land into buildings. How does that then relate to our production systems? It looks at things like climate change, pollution. All these things drive the production system and have an impact in the global food system. I think this then gives you the context around which as an organization we are trying to work and why we then interlink with some of the things that you see us doing, things around engaging with the regulators to develop laws and regulations that are critical, how we work with students and people on social media and social media breakers to drive information, awareness, how we then work around animal welfare and biological systems, the environment, the workers, the farming system in them. We are now doing studies around antimicrobial resistance and what you're seeing, how it's impacting on farming system is impacting on the environment. And then how then the retailers and the wholesalers and the rest of the business and all these things then go on to what the consumer is able to, what ends up on the consumer table and drives what consumers do. You say that, let's then narrow down on factory farming. Factory farming is basically an industrial farming system in which animals are raised in highly intensive methods, confined and often in overcrowded conditions. And a good example is the chicken shed that you're seeing on your right. The goal of a factory farming is to minimize costs while we maximize profits. And ideally what we are saying is that This then drives the process around which the animal welfare is not catered for. Research is showing that it's not sustainable, and we then need to think how we then work around it to ensure that factory farming becomes sustainable, the needs of the animals are catered for, and then whatever negative impacts that it has are also looked into. And part of the sustainability is the fact that factory farming is actually driving destruction of wild animal habitats, because we are converting places like the Amazon for production of animal feeds, which then has a negative impact or contributes to climate change. And also, how do we then handle manure that is coming from these factory farms? I want to say it this way, that in our studies and in our experience, in most of Africa, we have not reached where we are calling ourselves factory farming. We are intensively farming, but we have not reached factory farming levels. Our levels of intensification are not yet there. But the challenge is that Africa is moving towards that, and we need to take a step back and think and look at the developed world, which is slowly moving back to less factory, high welfare production systems, which are not factory farms for that matter. Factory farming is also known to be very destructive and reliant on appalling animal suffering, as I've already stated. Worker hardship is something that has also been seen, and in various investigative processes, we've seen the level of how workers are mishandled in some of these things. But above that, factory farming also drives unacceptable practices, which include things like close confinement, early weaning of animals. Animals then live in poorly ventilated environments, which lead to respiratory conditions. They undergo routine painful mutilations like castration. The top pig on the picture on your right, things like debeaking in chickens. And then animals in these production systems tend to have very fast growth rates, which the world is now discussing. I know in broilers, we are now saying we need to slow the growth rate, because then it has certain negative physiological impacts on the animal. But overall, and I think relating to today's discussion, animal factory farming has been seen to have excessive use of antibiotics, which then contribute to the antimicrobial resistance that we're talking about at certain levels. Factory farming is also been seen, and last year when we started looking at the pandemic, the United Nations Environmental Program, in collaboration with International Livestock Research Institute, did a quick survey and study looking at what has happened globally from 1940, and published the document you're seeing on your right that quickly shows, it talks about preventing the next pandemic, zoonotic diseases, and how to break the chain of transmission. And essentially what the document shows is that intensive farming has been responsible for half of the zoonotic infections that have occurred in the world between 1940 and today, including things like swine flu, bird flu, Nipah virus, which are all well documented. But it's also clearly showing that factory farming is laying a foundation for another devastating health crisis, the antimicrobial resistance, that we then need to address and to look at. Going to antimicrobial resistance, now that we understand what factory farming is all about. The speakers before me Dr. Yara already defined these terms relatively very well. What an antimicrobial refers to any substance, natural or synthetic or semi-synthetic, that kills or inhibits the growth of microorganisms, but causes little or no damage to the host. And antimicrobial resistance occurs when the organisms mutate in ways that render the mitigating substance used to cure the infection ineffective. So when you look at antibiotic use, I think especially at a farming level, the reality is that antibiotics are being used to, and I will concentrate on the antibiotic bit of it and leave the rest of the antimicrobials, for reasons being that that's what's been studied intensively in production systems. The use of other things like antihelminthics, antiprotozoals are relatively at minimal levels. The biggest drug used in production system is actually antibiotics, and hence the rest of my presentation will concentrate on antibiotics. But I think the principles apply to the other compounds that constitute antimicrobials. So in reality, we've found that antibiotics are used to prop factory farming systems, especially because it helps to reduce sickness in animals that are living in very poor conditions. And there's ample scientific data available, and I'll highlight one or two studies that we've done ourselves to show that antibiotic overuse is actually leading to creation of superbugs, which are organisms that are resistant to 2 or 3 or more antibiotics. Where do we use antibiotics in farming? There are 3 main places that antibiotics are used in farming. The first one was for growth promotion. And this used to happen in earlier days, and the use of growth promotion has actually been discontinued, especially in the European Union. And especially what happens in growth promotion is where we use therapeutic doses of antibiotics to then help the animal to grow. And since 2006, as I have said, this was discontinued in the European Union. 71% of World Organization for Animal Health, OIE members, have stopped using antibiotics as growth promoters. I think the challenge is that in places like Africa, the study and how far that has happened is something that is still out there, and there needs to be more concerted effort in actually raising awareness and finding out what is actually happening here on the continent. Antibiotics are also used for treatment of infections, and as an organization, we say that antibiotics should be used for treatment of infections where the disease has been diagnosed, a veterinarian has been seen. I liked the clip that Julian used from FAO that shows that first you need to actually have a veterinarian look at the sick animal and then do a diagnosis, go through the whole process, taking samples to the lab and confirming that the animal is actually sick and needs to be treated with a specific antibiotic that then manages that disease. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen in the African context. We tend to have the farmers then, when the animal falls sick, either getting information from other farmers or from an agrovet, which has not looked at the animal. And ultimately then we are ending up with antibiotics being used when they are not necessary. And I think as veterinarians and as animal health workers, one of the things we are trying to drive is people need to change their concept where we use broad spectrum antibiotic to cover for any disease that we see, instead of doing the proper diagnosis and identifying which antibiotic to use. And that we'll see later how that happens. Then, of course, there's also the use of antibiotics for prophylaxis and metaphylaxis, which simply involves administering antibiotics to healthy animals to prevent infections. And I think this is one of the things that is really driving antibiotic resistance on the continent, because farmers in a roundabout way, farmers and producers have discovered that if I have a production system that is poor in hygiene, poor ventilated, or doesn't meet certain standards, then if I just put antibiotics at low dose levels, then the animals don't get sick. Unfortunately, what the producers and the farmers that do this don't understand is that whatever you put into the animal production system ultimately ends up on your plate, because the animal is very good at concentrating some of these things. So if you use antibiotics, you end up with antibiotics in the food, but also alongside that, you end up in selecting susceptible, getting rid of susceptible bacteria and leaving antimicrobial resistant organisms, which then end up in the food chain, as we're going to show in the subsequent slides. Some facts for us to look at and to grapple with. It's believed that about 131,000 tons of antibiotics are used annually in farming, and this accounts for 75% of all antibiotics produced globally. So essentially what we are saying is that 75% of antibiotics that is produced globally by mass actually ends up in farming systems, which then means that they are most likely ending up on your plate, or alternatively, they're ending up in creating antibiotic resistant organisms, which then ultimately ends up in your plate. And I think that's something that we then need to be looking at and seeing, how do we then reduce the amount of antibiotics that are being used in the production system? As an organization, looking at our global survey, we believe that between 40 to about 70% of the antibiotics being used in farming system, and predominantly in pigs and poultry and dairy production systems, are not necessary. All we need to do is the right thing. We need to have a good environment with good hygiene and sanitation and good biosecurity, and proper management to reduce the use of antibiotics in our production systems. It's estimated that about 600 and around 63,000 tons of antibiotics were used in livestock in 2010, and 67% of it's projected that there'll be a 67% rise in the use of antibiotics by 2030, which is 8 years down the line, especially in what is known as the BRICS country: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. It's interesting. I put this out there because the situation in Africa is not very clear, and I think most of the African countries will be around where BRICS are. The use of antibiotics is literally going to double in the next over the next 10 years, and that's something that we need to be critically looking at and starting to address at certain levels. 90 countries have prohibited the use of antibiotics in growth promotion. Remember, I said that slowly countries are moving away from growth promotion, the use of antibiotics as growth promoters. However, only 6 countries have prohibited the use of antibiotics for prophylaxis. And that is something then again we need to be looking at. While we are reducing use of antibiotics for growth promotion, we are still not addressing the use of where people are able to use antibiotics to prevent disease instead of using other means of preventing disease. And in a 2017-2018 FAO global survey, 10 out of 78 countries surveyed had regulations limiting antibiotic residues being discharged into the environment. Only 10 out of 78, which is a small number. So it means that antibiotic residues are still being discharged into the environment. And it's interesting, even you look at it from a farming perspective, if farmers have used antibiotics and the antibiotic residues are in the manure, for instance, what do we do with that manure, and how do we manage that manure? Is that manure causing problems because it ultimately ends up being used in food, in producing of crops, as happens in most of the African countries? How then do we manage that situation? We are currently doing a study with the Kenya Agriculture Livestock Research Institute at looking at the impact of pig manure on the environment around the pig and the waterways around pigs, which we'll be releasing maybe early next year, but very interesting results coming from that study. It has been shown that over 40% of E. coli bacteria detected in poultry production systems in the US, China, Brazil, UK, Germany, France, and Spain are resistant to antibiotics commonly used in farms, in those farms. And that's very interesting because it then means that that exposure of the organism to antibiotics is ultimately leading to resistance, and that E. coli is still in the same environment. How then does it look like when it's carrying antibiotic resistant genes and interacting with in places where then it might end up in the food chain? And the question then we asked ourselves, what about Africa? And studies need to be done around that. It is estimated that 24% reduction of antibiotic resistant bacteria will occur if people restrict antibiotic use in food animals. And that is something that we then need to start interrogating and say, if we just, we would have a 24% reduction of antibiotic resistant bacteria if we just restrict the use of antibiotics in food animals. That would be very interesting and something that we are following up as an organization. Now, to then looking at beyond the facts, then let's look at practical things that we've done as an organization to just confirm some of these things that we are seeing and we are saying. In 2018, we had a study that what we call the pork and the superbug crisis. It was basically what happened is we bought pork products from supermarkets in Brazil, Spain, Thailand, United States, Australia, and several other countries. And then just tested them. You brew a bacteria from the sample, the meat that we bought, and then try to isolate organisms, and whatever the organisms that were isolated were then tested for antibiotic resistance. And essentially what it showed, and I think I want you to concentrate on the two boxes at the bottom of the screen. In the US, 14 out of 16 of the samples bought from Walmart, which is a big supermarket, showed that they had tested positive for antibiotic resistant bacteria, but more worrying was that 9 out of the 16 were shown to have multi-drug resistant bacteria that are resistant to 3 or more antibiotics, what we know as superbugs. So essentially, what we're seeing is that at the supermarket level, we are having products that are already carrying superbugs or antibiotic resistant organisms. And that then, the question then is how does that then play into human health? Because you are having food products that are already carrying antibiotic resistant genes in certain bacteria. What about Africa? So in last year, we then replicated the same study in Africa, and in this case, we then did it in Kenya. Remember, around about April, May is when the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic broke out. Hence, because of movement restriction, we were only able to do the study in Kenya. But we are hoping that as the world starts opening up, that we will replicate the study in several other African countries in next year and the next 2 or so years. In Kenya, we then looked at the 6 big supermarkets and collected samples from their branches across 5 counties. And the samples were then sent to Kenya Medical Research Institute, the Center for Microbiology Research. And essentially, in this case, we expanded the study to include chicken meat. So it was pork and chicken meat that we are looking at. Bacteria was isolated. We ended up with about 611 bacterial isolates from about 384 samples of pig and poultry samples, meat samples. And the bacteria isolates, 48% of the bacteria isolated from the products were actually E. coli. I think the worrying thing for us in this study was the 18% that is Salmonella and the 8% that were Shigella, and then the 7% that were catalase staph related. And those are food-related organisms that cause food problems. The E. coli was not worrying until we did further tests to confirm that they could be the highly strains that are highly pathogenic to humans. And so it's interesting, 47% of the isolates of the E. coli isolates were in pork, and chicken had a 49.2%. 49.2% of the samples had E. coli. I've given indications just to show how, again, the number of samples that had E. coli and Klebsiella pseudomonas was the least. I think we had only 2 isolates of pseudomonas, and again, as indicated, Salmonella, Shigella, and Staphylococcus were some of the isolates. When we looked at the isolates, and I think there's a slide I did put here from the study, one of the things that came out is that about 34% of the isolates were actually resistant to 3 or more organisms for the chicken samples, and there's almost about 40% for the pig samples, which quickly shows that even in the African context, at the supermarket level, you're still having antibiotic resistant genes or antibiotic resistant organisms being found at the food, which then indicates that somewhere along the value chain or the production system, we are contaminating the product with organisms that are becoming very critical. And I also want to highlight from the study that about 39% of the organisms were resistant to tetracyclines, 34% to sulfamethoxone, 33% to ampicillin, and I think some of them, especially cefoxiline and the last one, are actually medicaments that are used in human. And again, we were testing against the World Health Organization critical antibiotic list, and you can see that we have, from a production perspective and coming from farming systems, resistant organisms that are having resistance to drugs that are even used for human medicine. And that's the critical connection that we need to say, and something that we really worrying in terms of farming systems. If our farming doesn't change, then we will be coming, a lot of organisms or resistant organisms will be coming from production systems, and that will be ending up in the food chain, which then has an impact in human health at certain levels. In conclusion, what are we saying? We're saying that on AMR, we as an organization are saying that industry needs to improve animal welfare, because OIE, and as you indicated on the bottom right, OIE has recognized, actually the tripartite has recognized that increased animal welfare is a prerequisite to reduction of antimicrobial use in production systems. So we need to improve the welfare of the animal. We need to look at what the animal is being fed on. We need to look at it around the 5 fundamental freedoms that we look at in animal production in terms of welfare, ensuring the animal has good quality food and clean water, because that then ensures that the animal's immune status is at a good level, and the food must be able to meet the animal's physiological status and requirements. We need to ensure that the animal is put in a good environment, and I think our biggest challenge in the African context that is contributing to antimicrobial resistance is the fact that our production system is not very good at hygiene standards. Our biosecurity is not very good. You find that animals are getting contaminated, humans are bringing in contaminants into the production system. Our biosecurity is allowing rodents and wild birds into the chicken or pig houses, which then contributes to contamination. And that then leads to a disease, and that then leads to the need of antibiotics being put into the production system. We need to look at managing disease in terms of ensuring that the animals are vaccinated when they are required. In fact, one of the things that we need to be critically looking at is to ensure that vaccinations are done at appropriate for both all the production animals, and ensure that that then minimizes the need for antibiotics, because the animal doesn't get sick at certain levels. We are saying that international organizations and governments need to support veterinarians, to support responsible use of antibiotics. I know through the National Antimicrobial Action Plan, Reduction Action Plan for countries like Kenya, we say that we need to ensure that there's responsible use of antibiotics. I know in Kenya we've even done guidelines for prudent use of antibiotics in farm animals, but I think that we've not sensitized the producers enough to understand the connection between use of antibiotics, antimicrobial resistance, and the impact it has in terms of food safety. And that's something that we need to drive as responsible as citizens, because people need to make that connection. I think one of the things that has happened, and when I talk to people, to students and the general public, is that people think that the antibiotics that we use in farm animals is different from the antibiotics that is used for human medicine. And essentially that connection needs to be made aware, so that people realize that whatever you're doing at farm animals, and especially the antibiotics you're using, they're the same active ingredients that are being used in human health. And so long as animals then there's some level of resistance at the animal level, it will be propagated into human level. The other thing that is important is also people to understand that the antibiotics that we use ultimately end up on your plate, because it leaves certain residues that then means that whoever is drinking the milk or the eggs is actually being exposed to therapeutic doses of the antibiotics due to the residues, and that then builds the resistance at the human level. So as an organization, we are saying there must be responsible use of antibiotics as part of the antibiotic stewardship that ensures that we drive it level. And then finally, we are saying that consumers need to support higher welfare production system. And part of what we are saying is, as we look at production systems, the production systems tend to react to what consumers are saying. When I started off working in the production system some 30 odd years ago, we drove the industry, the poultry industry drove what came to your table. We said, this was a broiler, this is what you're going to eat. But over the years, what has happened is the power has shifted from producers into consumers. And so consumers are able to drive what supermarkets are going to put on their shelves, and supermarkets then are able to drive what producers are going to put to produce, because it's based on the purchasing power of the consumer. And that is something that the reason why as an organization, we take a lot of time working with the general public and consumers, because when you raise the level of awareness and they can ask the right questions, then they're driving and forcing consumers, producers to do the right thing. A classical example to just drive that point home is we are now seeing organizations and big organizations beginning to say by 2025, 2030, that they will not be buying eggs from a cage production system. That is all being driven by consumers being shown this is how eggs are being produced. You're putting animals in cages that are rarely the size of a microwave oven. You have 5 birds living for 1.5 years in the size of a cage the size of a microinvolvement. They can't move, they can't do anything, and you are expecting them to produce eggs. And essentially what has happened is there's a big global movement to move birds out of cage systems, and that is the same thing we are trying to replicate in antimicrobial use or use of antibiotics in the production system. Get the consumer to understand that whatever is put at the producer level ends up on your plate, then make buying decisions by forcing your retailers, the restaurants or the fast food or the retailers to then do the right thing, which then forces, and we've seen it happening in our production systems. With big brands coming into Africa, we are beginning to see organizations demanding, looking at doing audits, looking at antibiotic use, looking at welfare of the animal, the production system, which is then driving the welfare as towards high welfare production system, which then means we'll end up with better products and neater products at that matter. All this thing is being driven by the 2017 World Health Organization FAO OIE Global Framework for Stewardship of to combat antimicrobial resistance. And I think as an organization, we are part and parcel of that process. In fact, at the global level, we have an MOU. We are the only NGO that has an MOU with OIE, which then allows us to work around certain things that have been agreed on by the tripartite. And for the current program going into the next 10 years, AMR is going to be one of the places that we'll be working on vigorously. That's the Global Action Plan. I think most of you have seen it, and which I've referred to. And I just want to conclude by showing that consumers are actually getting whatever we are saying, and showing that driving the work at the consumer level is actually bearing fruits, is the fact that consumers are being driven by driving improved farm animal welfare standards, because they are beginning to see that if the welfare of the animal is catered for, and in certain surveys, knowledge, attitude, and practices surveys, we've quickly seen that where the knowledge is under the consumers beginning to understand the implication of some of these things, then they're able to do they're able to make certain decisions. I've just shown a newspaper cutting, I think a 2017 newspaper, one of the local newspapers in Kenya, which shows Brookside, which is one of the big dairy producers in Kenya, stopped paying for milk based on the volume of milk and started looking at quality. And if you read that article, one of the things that came out is part of the quality is to ensure that the milk has no antibiotic residues or antibiotics in the milk. And that then is driving the producers that sell milk to Brookside to start ensuring that the animal is not being given antibiotics unnecessarily, and that there is nothing being added into the milk once it's been collected. So essentially, that is all being driven by consumers. Consumers' concerns are leading to greater transparency in the questions are being asked. They're leading to proper food labeling, and that's something that Africa is beginning to look at. What's a high welfare product? What's a free range product? What's an organic product? What's a general product? And then it's leading to reduced antibiotic use, because consumers are beginning to say antibiotics should not be in a product in the food that comes out at the end of the day, which then is driving farm animal welfare standards. And I think that is my last slide. Thank you very much for having me and for giving me the opportunity to make the presentation. Back to you, Julia.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yamo. And indeed, thank you for sharing all those insights. I'm sure we've all learned a lot, right from this, how complicated a system it is, the sustainable food system that actually has the farming inputs, in addition, the economic, political aspects, the biological aspects, and the social aspects. So, and also you shed a lot of light on the research that World Animal Protection has been doing. And some of the statistics there are really alarming, further substantiating the fact that we really need to act. And as future, I know there are quite a number of students even within this platform that are attending the future veterinarians that will have when they transition to their practice. And also we should continue, as what came out very clearly is also the relationship, as we're talking in our last session, that this is really a One Health, the One Health approach is the best in addressing AMR, because of the connection that we have seen that these food safety issues ultimately affect everyone. And then we should also be making sure that even in our own context, looking at the challenges we have been told by all the speakers that have been talking to us, that what actions can we take, including also encouraging farmers, even right in our context, our relatives, etc., looking at the growth, promotion, all that misuse that is happening. There's a lot of lack of awareness. He talked about the use even in prophylaxis, where farmers sometimes just use to make sure that their animals do not get sick. The withdrawal periods, very key. So at this juncture, I'll also remind you that I think from the two presentations and even the presentations before, you can see as students that there are a lot of areas that are potential areas for research. We need evidence, we need the data in this, our context, so that at least we can further influence our different stakeholders, including the policymakers. So think as much as possible on what areas you can even use for even your thesis or going forward. Publish papers around a lot of areas. I could see even as we are going through Dr. Yamo's presentation that there are a lot of areas for potential research there. So we'll move over to the question and answer session, which I'll hand over to my co-moderator, Daniel Wairungi, to take us through some of the questions. I think I saw quite a number in the chat. Maybe you can pick a few for both our presenters. So over to you, Daniel. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Julian. Thank you, Dr. Yara and Dr. Yamu, for the informative presentations. Indeed, it has been a learning experience, so much, very intensive learning, and I'm sure we have been able to identify some of the areas that we would love to engage. I'll pick several questions. There have been so many questions, so many good comments coming in the chat box, and hopefully we'll continue with the discussions even after the session. So I'll start off with the antimicrobial stewardships questions to Dr. Yara. So I'll just highlight a few and try to see especially the ones that are quite distinct from each other. So the first question that I'll pick was from Julius, and he was asking what methods can we use to identify baseline data that informs choice of AMS programs. What methods can we use to identify baseline data that informs the choice of AMS programs to adopt in these healthcare settings? Maybe let me just start from the beginning. Thank you, Dr. Yara, for the wonderful presentation. Antimicrobial stewardship program needs to be tailored to specific healthcare settings. What methods can we use to identify baseline data that informs choice of programs to adopt in this setting? Over to you, Dr. Yara.
Okay. Hello, can you hear me clearly?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, that's actually a very good question. As I was talking quite a while ago, that it's very important to have a baseline data to identify the needs of the place that you're working in, so you can start doing your actions based upon this. Actually, you can start by, you have, I can say, two main domains that you can start working on. The first domain is having a PPS or a point prevalence survey, which can be done on a patient level and a hospital level. Actually, there was an earlier presentation I've done before with Dr. Daniel regarding the PPS and the point prevalence surveillance tool and how we can use to be able to obtain data on the patient's level, to highlight the antimicrobial consumption, the indications, the most common indication where antimicrobial is prescribed, the most common antimicrobials that are prescribed, and so on. So this can definitely help you out. Another thing is an AMR surveillance data. So you can start working, there is the WHO net. This is a, it's a open access. It's a free application that the microbiologist per se can download and can enter the susceptibility data on this application or software program. And then they do actually have these isolates and report them on the WHO net. And then you can come up with a analysis regarding the AMR situation in your hospital settings, and then you can disseminate these reports. It will definitely help you identify the areas or the let's say departments where there is mostly have AMR resistance, and then the PPS can help you with the antimicrobial consumption. I hope that answered your question. Over to you, Daniel.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Yara, for that. Yeah, thank you for the reminder. Yeah, I'll share the presentation that we had. I think it was end of last year with the group 2. It was quite a lengthy and informative session on point prevalence surveys, so that at least we are also able to kind of go through the presentation too. The other question, Dr. Yara, maybe from your experience, what are the barriers that you have experienced while implementing antimicrobial stewardship program, maybe in the hospital?
Okay, so again, this is really a very, very good question, because actually there are different barriers. Again, it differs from one hospital setting to another regarding the type of hospital itself and the availability of the tools. But I guess the most common thing, which is the resistance of the prescribers, say on real practice, I think sorry, I'm really sorry, the internet connection still.
It's okay, Dr.
Can you hear? Oh, yes. Okay, sure. So, okay, thank you. I was just saying I was having such a rough time dealing with the surgeons. So again, we can categorize this under one main domain, which is the inappropriate knowledge towards antimicrobial prescribing. This is one of the very common barriers. Again, the leadership support, it's a huge barrier. So you need to work on building up a case to present to the leadership, so you can start actually having their support and their commitment, so you can implement your interventions. I believe this is very important. Another barrier, I believe, which is the diagnostics. It's really very important to have these, to be certain of the diagnostic results. So this is a thing. And the other thing is the availability of rapid diagnostics. This can help you out with the implementation process. I believe the fourth barrier I can say, which is the research. I believe research, there is not enough research. I'm talking specifically in my country regarding the antimicrobial resistance and gaps in the knowledge, attitudes, and practices of the physician. Lately, in the past 2 years, we started to have some research regarding this, but I believe we need more to help us assess actually the current situation, and then and potential focal points for implementation. I hope this answered your question. Over to you, Daniel.
Yeah, thank you for that. Maybe to follow up on that question, what maybe on some of the interventions that we can institute. Judith shared. Thank you, Dr. Yara, for the great and informative presentation on the CDC core elements. From your experience, how best can we enforce this, especially for facilities in rural areas where there is extreme shortage of staff, such as one nurse, e.g. you have one nurse and one clinical officer, and in these facilities are also kind of forgotten during trainings and workshops for capacity building.
Again, this is a very good question. I've actually received a similar question from one of my students I was working with. She used to work in this like public health, small public health center. Again, I really try to make it clear that you can implement stewardship with very, you don't need to do all the interventions. You don't need to have this huge capacity. You can do very basic interventions. I mean, if you're just prescribing antibiotics for patients who do have only infections, bacterial infections per se, you are actually applying principles of antimicrobial stewardship. So I always stand by the NHS recommendation, which says start smart, then focus. You can do this very basic intervention. So per se, I said to one of my students, if you just help out the nurse, she told me that she's like the only pharmacist out there and there are only like a couple of nurses. So I told her, if you just help the nurses out by doing this, let's say flow chart of the list of the antibiotics that you do have in this center and the proper administration of these antimicrobials, you are helping her out again to minimize the harm caused to the patients. So again, you are helping in implementing the antimicrobial stewardship. So it doesn't have to be sophisticated interventions. Again, you can do similar, very small actions, but sustainable actions. And maybe later on, when you do have a possible capacity or let's say resources, you can enhance this later on. But you can start by very simple things in the healthcare setting or the center you are working in. Over to you, Danny.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, and also emphasizes the need of starting with what you have and starting small. To the last question, I think for the others that you have not addressed, I'll share them across with you via mail, so that at least due to time. Maybe kindly share your brief knowledge on the impact of drug marketing and promotion on antibiotic consumption and how we can address and how these challenges can be addressed. Yeah, maybe from your experience.
Yes, this is very, very, very important. Again, actually, this is one of the drivers to antimicrobials misuse. And again, it's addressed in the current document by the WHO, the Integrated Antimicrobial Stewardship Activities. It's actually a main pillar in applying a proper antimicrobial stewardship program. So again, this is very important, the impact of the pharmaceutical companies and incentives and so on. I believe we can start at least, of course, if we have enforced legislations and rules and so on, this will be very helpful. But from our side, I guess we can start on addressing the prescriber's behavior. So we can start working on this point. Sorry. So if we work on the knowledge of the prescriber and how consistent he is regarding the decision of adding or stopping the antimicrobial, this will help somehow to stand and face the part of the legislations towards the advertising per se of antimicrobials and so on. So the part that from our end that we can work on is enhancing the prescriber's behavior. And of course, on the national level, maybe there will be some rules and legislations towards the advertising per se of antimicrobials, towards the over-the-counter dispensing of antimicrobials and so on. But again, what we can do from our end is enhancing the behavioral and educational and knowledge part of the physicians, maybe by physicians and even pharmacists, maybe by start working like what we're doing right now, starting with the undergraduates. They are the future. So actually, this is, I believe it's a huge thing, and it's a very important thing to do. Over to you, Daniel.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Yara. Thank you so much also for addressing the questions. And it has been a pleasure having you, as always. So much information. And yeah, I believe, as you have said, at least this session, we have the future healthcare practitioners, and I think it's a major step in behavior change. Yeah, thank you. So I'll go over to animal health, to Dr. Yamo, and I'll start with a question on diagnostics. Maybe you can address it from a One Health perspective. So the question is I understand setting up a microbiology culture and sensitivity lab is quite expensive given the middle and low income status of our nations, and the culture and sensitivity procedure requires some days. In your practice, that's some time before resistance can be confirmed. Sorry, let me just start the question. Sorry for that. The question is from Brian, and Brian asks, I understand setting up a microbiology culture and sensitivity lab is quite expensive, this given the middle and low income status of our nations. And the culture and sensitivity procedure requires some days. That's some time before resistance can be confirmed. In your practice, are there some cheap yet more effective approaches to quickly detect antimicrobial resistance or sensitivity that you could recommend? Dr. Yamo, from an animal health perspective, how can you address this? You're on mute.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you, Brian, for that question. I think it's all in the mindset. Let me start by the so-called, it's expensive to set up a lab for culture and sensitivity. In my experience, and when I worked for the big organization called Kenchik, we did have a lab, a basic lab. And essentially what you're looking for is a lab that can do microbiology, and then with some sensitivity discs, which you can get from some of the vet pharmaceutical producers. You can then use that. But my point is that, one, you don't need a lab. In my experience working across Africa, you can actually use a human lab, and this is where the One Health concept then works, because the organisms are the same. You don't need to set up a lab. You can actually use the nearest human medical laboratory that's available. That's one way to go. The second way to look at it is from, and it's something that we've looked at in the Kenyan context, is using the available resources. The Directorate of Veterinary Services in most of these countries have regional veterinary investigation laboratories, which we rarely use. Last year, I spent time running across Kenya collecting data from the regional veterinary investigation laboratories. We have about 7 of them, and very interesting data. In fact, I think they generate a lot of good data on resistance and organisms being isolated. I think later on we will be able to produce a paper around that, but nobody looks at that. Farmers take their products, take their samples to those labs. The labs then do the tests and have the results of which organism was isolated and what they're using sensitivity disc, what they're resistant to. But again, nobody looks at that. So I think in the African context, there's a lot of data we are sitting with. I am now working with 2 of the big producers of pig and chickens in Kenya, and one of them even extends into other countries. And one of the things we are saying is they have a lab, some of them have labs. Nobody has ever looked at what is coming out of that lab, because that's where we start looking at patterns. It's not a question of today I go to the lab, but you start by what is the data saying? You see, a lot of, when you go to literature, you don't find data that says these are the organisms, this is what's challenging. But that data is there, it's just not been analyzed. And that's something that we would be interested to work in. But for a clinician, the first line, if we then have experience in handling some of these diseases, it's easy to know what is bacterial and what's not bacterial. And you find people giving antibiotics for viral conditions which should have been vaccinated, or they say you're giving it supportive therapy, and that's where we have a problem. Until that diagnosis is made and you go to a lab and find that it's a bacterial condition, then you can use experience and judgment to then use. And as I think Yara talked about, it start with the simplest antibiotic before going to the reserve drugs for that matter, because there's a classification around that. And I think that's where the challenge is. We as one, because of availability of antibiotics across in agrovets, and Daniela and the rest who are in Kenyans, you know this thing. And I think it's the same in Uganda and Tanzania, which I've been to. You can easily buy any antibiotic, including the ones that are reserved drugs off the shelf. And that's where the problem starts, because the farmer or the producer is not going through the process of diagnostics, isolating the organism and getting the sensitivity. I agree it might take 2 or 3 days to get there, but if it's done properly, then you get the right. But the farmer is already using, by the time in my practice and experience, by the time the farmer calls you, she or he has tried all the non-antibiotics and they're not working. And that's why they're calling you as a veterinarian to come in and intervene. I think that is a mindset we are trying to change and say, let the animal be brought to me, let me look at it. It might not be a bacterial condition. Some of them are nutritional conditions. Some of them are simply poor management. In my experience, part of the reason why sometimes the antibiotic doesn't work is the chicken house is not changing. It still has the same poor ventilation. So irrespective of how much antibiotic you pump into that chicken, the chicken in that house, until you resolve the issue that the animal is simply in an unhygienic condition with poor biosecurity, poor ventilation, the disease is going to recur. You are not helping. And I think part of it is then advising farmers to build proper houses. So there's a whole layer of things that we need to be looking at in terms of managing diseases from a animal perspective. And the other challenge is a lot of us veterinarians don't even see the animal or don't even visit the farm. So I think part of what we are trying to encourage veterinarians to do is to do what we call herd health or flock health, where you are actually visiting the farm and looking at factors that could lead to disease and then mitigating against them. So if it's poor ventilation, you're helping the farmer to understand that they need to improve on the ventilation, open the curtains, not close the house too much. If it's wet litter, you're helping the farmer understand that that litter needs not to be wet, must consistently, and looking at the management, because a lot of diseases that we end up seeing are actually caused by poor management or poor environment. And I think that's where we need to go back. I hope that gives clarity. Back to you, Daniel.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was well and very comprehensive. We can take one more question, and it's on antibiotic residues in animals. So it's from Saddam. So Saddam says, thank you so much, Dr. Victor, about the knowledge on antibiotic use and antibiotic resistance in the animal environment. But why is it that we only concentrate on the use of antibiotics in food animals than putting restrictions and standards that minimize antibiotics or antibiotic residues consumption from animal meat? For example, in Africa, many people eat meat from readily bought and slaughtered animals, especially chickens at ceremonies, parties, roadsides, and other functions. Yet these birds actually consume antibiotics daily. I suggest, and then he goes on to offer suggestion. I suggest standards should be put to observe withdrawal periods and prohibit the public from consuming birds and other animals after antibiotic treatment failure or restrict antibiotics. But the main question is why we concentrate on that so much. You have addressed it, but maybe you would go a bit deeper.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel, and thank you, Saddam, for that question. I think the perception is that we are laying emphasis on antibiotic use in farm animals. The reality is that from where I sit, we are trying to, as I said, it's a complex issue. You cannot just isolate one of it. There are issues around use of antibiotics itself. There are uses around availability of the antibiotics themselves. Remember, antibiotics are prescription-only drugs, but in Africa, you can buy them over the counter, which is something that we need to address. And it's not because we are lacking laws or regulations. It's because we are not implementing laws and regulations. It's because we have been a bit lax. And I think part of what we are trying to push for in the countries that we work in is to start strictly controlling antibiotics so that they are not readily available. Because if that happens, then the farmer or producer will be forced to do the right thing. I agree with Saddam that there are certain things that happens, like slaughter for ceremonies, which then might be animals are being slaughtered that have not, which are still being under treatment. In fact, for me, the worrying thing is that in some cases, when we condemn an animal because it's not been able to be treated, it actually ends up being slaughtered, and that's something that we need to address. So part of what we're doing as an organization, and I think I highlighted it when we started, is that we are starting to say, let's develop industry standards and regulations, or work with organizations to develop internal policies that then address those issues. So we are working with the restaurants, and we are working with supermarkets and retailers and saying, what is your buyback? What is your supplier policy? If I am a supplier and I'm bringing you eggs, are you interested to know whether the eggs are coming from chickens that are on treatment? Because ideally the eggs should not be used for human consumption, because the antibiotic residues will go into the eggs. That is why we are saying, when the consumer is aware, then the consumer can push that. If they're not aware, and that's what has been happening since the general public has not been aware on the connection between treating an animal, withdrawal periods, and the product that is ending on your table, you end up finding that milk or eggs or even meat from animals that are being treated are seeping into the food chain. As we raise the awareness of the consumer, and the consumer starts asking the hard question, it then forces the retailer, whoever is selling food to them, to then push the producers. And that's why we are talking about a food system, and we are looking at it from that perspective. And so as we raise awareness, and it's good I'm talking to students, the future people will be managing this process. Now you're aware. So when you go to a farmer and they're treating animals, so you recommend a treatment, then it's for you to also ensure that the farmer is doing the right thing, and whatever is coming out of that production system at that point is not getting into the food chain. I know there are challenges, because then farmers ask you, what do you do with the eggs? What do you do with the milk? And I think that's a discussion that we need to have. The second level is then drive industry and government to follow, one, develop regulations, and two, where regulations or laws are there, they implement them. I think our biggest challenge in the African context is that we develop these things. One, the way we develop laws, and I'll give you a good example, and I alluded to the fact that we have developed something known as guidelines for prudent use of antibiotics in farm animals. It was developed through a government system which a lot of industry players were not involved in. And so there is this good legislation. Industry is not aware about it, and so they're not able to apply it. So part of what we are then doing is to sensitize industry and say, there's this good piece of legislation, because once the legislation or the regulation is in place, the stakeholders need to be sensitized. And so we are doing that sensitization and saying, before you do certain things, this is what the good prudent use of antibiotics is all about. And then beyond that, then asking the relevant government authority to implement. Yeah? If the Pharmacy and Poisons Law, Cap 244 in Kenya, says that antibiotics are prescription only, why are we then getting antibiotics being sold over the counters without prescription, both at the human level and at the veterinary level, at the animal level? That's something that we need to address. Is a question of implementation of the law or the regulation to drive that process. And I think those are the things, and that's why I say it's a complex thing, and we need to look at it from that perspective, that we need to engage at all the levels, raise awareness, implement the law as it is, to ensure that antibiotics are not readily available, so that farmers do the right thing, engage the technical people so that they do the whole process, and enlighten the producers to do the right thing. So that's how I would answer it, Daniel. It's bigger. I think there's more to it than we can actually have in a 1 hour discussion. So I'd like to leave it at that point. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yamo. That was well addressed. Yeah, and I think we can also have future sessions where we can also address some of these complex factors. I'll hand over to Julian. Maybe Julian, if you have something before we kind of have a small summary of our next session. Over to you, Julian.
All right. Thank you so much, Daniel. And thanks again to our presenters. And thank you for addressing all the questions. And I would just want to reiterate that something that was coming out very strongly is the issues of awareness, and how we can try and make sure that the patients themselves, I think Dr. Yara mentioned that we should try and make sure that the patient understands the consequences of giving pressure to prescribers to get the antibiotics antimicrobials. So it will be important for the patient to understand that if I misuse or keep on requesting for these medicines, what are the consequences? That way it reduces the pressure. In the same way that Dr. Yamo has talked about empowering the consumers, so that at least the consumer knows that what I'm getting in my plate ultimately has consequences to my health. And I think you will notice that even in the WOW week theme for 2021 is also on actually spreading awareness to stop resistance. So awareness is a very big challenge. And if we manage to make sure that as many people are aware of this problem as possible, I'm sure we'll move in the right direction. So at this juncture, mine is just to say thank you so much to all, and a special thanks to our presenters for today for the excellent presentations. We have really been challenged, and the students, as I said, that it's good that this is being recorded. It's good that the presentations will be shared, because these are things that we can continue referring to. Right now, when we are doing research as students and also raising awareness amongst our fellow colleagues, and also even as we transition, as I say, to our professional careers, very useful resources that are there that you can actually utilize, as the goal of this program is to have champions. Like if you see our two presenters today, clearly they are champions for AMR who are trying to make sure that within their context, something is being done. So if we can have people like that, even in the context where we have a lot of shortage for human resources, if we have people that are passionate and are willing to drive this, even in the healthcare facilities, to make a very big difference, and in the communities. So maybe we'll just mention briefly what our next session is about. I'll leave Daniel to do that, but just before you do that, if you don't mind, I want to just take screenshots of who is here today. If you don't mind putting on your video for just 5 seconds, please do so that we can just capture a group photo. Thank you so much. All right, done. So before you speak, Daniel, I don't know whether our director is still with us. Dr. Meffin, I don't know whether you've got any comments to, I know he had another engagement at the same time, but if you've got any words to say. All right, before you speak, Daniel, I'll hand over to Dr. Yara for any closing remarks.
I just wanted to thank you again for the opportunity today. I just want to say one thing, that you are the future. All of the attendees here, you are the future. I hope you could really implement something in regards to the antimicrobial resistance, because this is really one of the huge threats that are affecting the current globe. So thank you so much again, Julie.
Thank you, Dr. Yara. Dr. Victor Yamo, any closing remarks from you?
Yeah, thank you, Julian, and the REACT team and SAS for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to say one or two things. As you highlighted, there is a lot of areas of research areas to work around. I think, again, as you also highlighted, a lot of opportunities to raise awareness, to change and shape the use of antimicrobials, and especially antibiotics, on the African continent, especially within the farming system. And I'm hoping that, having talked to the next generation of leaders, or the current leaders, you will take the message home. You will engage the community around which you are, the university community, the local community, where you come from, to just raise awareness on the criticalness of how we use antibiotics and the impact of misuse of antibiotics, especially in food animals, and how it then has a negative impact on food security and food safety, and ultimately livelihoods for the producers. For those who are interested, we as an organization have, you can follow us and you can see what you're doing and see how best you can link with us in terms of engaging. We do a lot of webinars, we do a lot of student engagement. So anytime that any ideas that you want us to engage in, let us know. And thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day, and back to you, Julian.
Right, thank you so much, Dr. Yamo. And indeed, we will share the presentations, we'll also share the contacts, because as I said, these are really champions who are willing to actually sacrifice their time to mentor students. If there's anything you have a question on, it's good to ask the experts and just have a greater understanding of whatever you're going through, even in your context and everything. So please feel free. We will also put the contacts in Slack so that you've got a permanent, you've got some access to this. So thank you so much, our presenters, once again, and thanks to all the students. I'd like to also mention that would like to give special thanks to all the students that are assisting, even as I mentioned before, in rapporteuring and in very much, the WhatsApp group is very active. Thank you so much to the students that have been sharing links, sharing what they are doing. Like I especially loved the group from Barara University in Uganda. We have actually formed an antimicrobial stewardship club in the institution. This is very encouraging, and those are the things that we would want to see more. Things that students are doing different activities in their institutions, trying to raise awareness, trying to see how best we can do work around AMR. So keep the discussions going, and thank you so much and well done for all that you're doing. So Daniel, you can just quickly let us know about our next session before we close. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much to our speakers, Dr. Yara and Dr. Yamo, for the wonderful session, and also for making time to React Director, Dr. Muffin, and to you, Julian, and all our attendees for, investing your time to attend the session. So from this point, I think now we'll be kind of transitioning a bit from the technical aspects to more of skill development. So that also, now that we are well empowered and we know what AMR is, what needs to be done, and now it's time that we are also build our capacity as leaders too. So next session we'll have a leadership session. We'll have two speakers, young speakers. They're still young, but they have been able to do quite a lot of influential work. And one of them will speak about personal competencies, on how you're supposed to maybe brand yourself, and how do you approach, how do you build this influence? Because as you also engage, it is good that if you package yourself in a way that you're also able to influence others, so that they're also able to listen to you, as it was highlighted in the video at the beginning. See the doctor there was sharing on you need to have someone who is well respected and who is acknowledged by other students, or maybe the people that you engage with, so that at least they also give you their time. So that's, we'll be transitioning to that. And also we also have good developments, especially those from Barara and also others that are doing other small activities. And we also like to tackle some bit of organizational leadership. How do you start a club, and what aspects do you look in terms of sustainability and all that? So we'll have two speakers, one speak on personal competencies and the other one will take us through organizational leadership. Then for the other session, we'll have policy and research. Yeah. So let's keep in touch. In case of any questions, feel free to share so that we can direct them to the speakers, and we'll also share the presentations and their contacts too. So thank you so much for making it to the session, and I wish us a wonderful weekend. And what you've learned, let's share it out there with our colleagues. Yeah, and hopefully we'll translate this to action. Thanks so much. Over to you, Julian.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Yeah, looking forward to those sessions where we have a session for the 11th of September. That's the one on leadership. And we also have another one the following week on the 18th on research and policy. So keep that in your calendar so that you make sure you make time to attend. So thank you, and very good comments coming from the chat for the excellent presentations today. So enjoy the rest of your weekend, and have a blessed weekend and the rest of the week ahead. Thank you and bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Thank you, Dorian.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye-bye, everybody. See you next week.
Thank you for coming. Bye.